Welcome to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. People's Republic originates on KOOP Austin and is also syndicated on WHIV New Orleans. I'm your host, Brian Griffith, and here's what's going down in your backyard and across the world. For this entire episode, we want to cover something that I think is of great importance, both nationally and throughout the state of Texas at this point, and that is the question of kind of access to abortion with the kind of right-wing attempts at essentially, what I believe to be trying to preempt or otherwise to challenge Roe versus Wade. I think it's important for people to be as educated as absolutely possible on kind of issues of their access to abortion, the legality of abortion, and as well as kind of the history of the struggle over reproductive rights and all that very important stuff. We're going to be joined by the full hour by the directors of two different organizations here. We are first joined by Beatriz Williams, the executive director of the Lilith Fund. Thank you, Amanda, for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
And we are also joined by Kamyon Conner, the executive director of the Texas Equal Access Fund. Thank you, Kamyon, as well.
Very excited to be here. Thank you.
Kamyon, if you can just give us kind of a rundown of the Texas Equal Access Fund, kind of your role in it and what kind of services you're able to provide.
Okay, great. The Texas Equal Access Fund is an abortion fund that was founded in 2005 by some local college students and their professor. Abortion funds really bridge the gap that our government doesn't do for citizens trying to seek abortion. So we provide financial assistance to people seeking abortions in the North Texas area. Financial assistance. We also provide some social supports as well with our social worker. We do clinic escorting for the clinics in our area as well. And I would say that our average donation grants for funding abortions here in North Texas is around $250. That's about how much assistance someone gets from us when they need support. How our program works is that we have a hotline that people can call and leave a message, and we have some very dedicated and amazing volunteers that return those calls at their convenience, usually in the evenings when they get off work, and do a short assessment with individuals and then provide additional funding for them to help them access abortion. Now, that being said, in the year 2018, we were able to help around 1,000 people in North Texas seeking abortion, but we received over 6,000 calls. So that lets you know that we aren't able to fund everyone that calls us. So support for us in Texas, all the abortion funds across the country, but here in Texas is very much needed.
And Amanda, if you can also kind of go over the Lilith Fund, how the kind of similarities there between services and also anything else, sort of the history of your organization as well, just so we understand like what both of these groups are.
Sure. So the Lilith Fund is a sister fund to the Texas Equal Access Fund, which we also call T-Fund. And Lilith Fund has been around since 2001. We were the first abortion fund in Texas. We were founded right here in Austin, Texas, by a group of community organizers, activists, lawyers, and advocates in our community who saw some really unjust and inequitable realities around abortion access in Texas. So Lilith Fund serves the central and southern regions of Texas. So we're in Austin, Houston, San Antonio. We also provide funding to clients who are seeking abortion in the clinics in El Paso and in the Valley. And so we work really closely with the other Texas abortion funds like T-Fund and others to ensure that people can afford the care that they need. And we also connect them to different resources so that they can also, access the travel needs associated with their visit, the lodging, sometimes it's plane tickets or bus tickets, And then, like the T Fund, we also, through our joint program with T Fund, we also have a social worker who works with our clients after their abortion care and supports them with emotional support, but also connections to different kinds of resources that they may need. And we also engage very much in the Texas legislature, doing different kinds of policy and advocacy work. We're working really closely with other partners in our community to build power and, collectively fight against attacks on reproductive rights and justice. And we're also doing a lot of leadership development with our clients and trying to do our best to center people who are most impacted by abortion restrictions. And as Kamyon pointed out, that's really the people who are calling abortion funds. So similar to P-Fund, we hear from hundreds of calls every single year. And as of now, because of funding restrictions, we're really only able to provide support to about a quarter of those who call us. And so the need is tremendous. And part of that is because there is no coverage for abortion care in the state of Texas, and there's no public funding of abortion care across the United States because of the Hyde Amendment, which I think we'll probably be talking about today. But coupled with all of the really harsh restrictions on abortion access in Texas and across the South, abortion, is really only a right on paper and can be really, really difficult to access. So organizations like Lilith and T work together, along with our other local Texas abortion funds, to ensure that everyone can get the care that they need, regardless of the financial and logistical barriers that are put in their way.
I think it's so important to recognize what you just said as far as abortion only really being sort of a legal right on paper, because I don't think people understand that legally speaking, there is very little that can kind of restrict somebody's access to abortion. But in fact, what is essentially preventing this and what is making abortion so hard for so many people, so many women across especially the South, but this is a problem I'm sure nationwide, is the kind of restrictions on funding on the one hand, the refusal of these states to provide anything, any sort of public access or anything to that sort of effect. Like it's very much sort of a draconian restriction of access that then becomes essentially a barrier of entry to abortion for working women, for especially Black, Latinx, Indigenous women, obviously trans men and non-binary people as well. And so, yeah, that to me, that becomes almost a sort of de facto legalization when you when you have a thing that's technically legal on paper, but it's out of reach for so large, so many people in the population cannot afford it because there's no access available. That to me then becomes a sort of de facto criminalization or illegalization of this particular thing. I'm wondering your thoughts, if either of you wants to kind of jump in on that one.
Yeah, I think this is Amanda with the Lilith Fund. I absolutely agree. I think, it's really clear when you understand who is struggling the most and who's disproportionately impacted by abortion restrictions and the abortion bans that we're seeing sweep the southern half of our country. And I think we really see it loud and clear on our hotlines, right? So the majority of people who have abortions are women of color. That's what we're seeing on our hotlines. And around 60% are parenting, right? So we also know that they're caring for families. They're also more likely to be enrolled in Medicaid coverage, right? And so we know that these are poor, working, caretakers of their families. And we also know that in southern states where we're seeing these attacks the harshest, there's high populations of people of color, right? And they're governed by legislatures who are mostly white men. So I think that there's absolutely a really notable point around how this trend of abortion restrictions very blatantly impact people of color, low-income people, and marginalized communities. And we can also see the imbalance of power that's making that, quite frankly, possible and more and more prevalent every day.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. And I would also like to uplift that In Texas, we have a lot of rural areas. We have a fair number of cities for a state, but we have a large amount of rural areas, and that creates such a barrier for people seeking abortions. And those are some of the places where their representatives representing them are the strictest and the harshest on people seeking abortion. I'd also like to uplift that we at the T Fund, we try to fund and provide financial assistance to any minor who is seeking a judicial bypass with a Jane's due process. So in Texas, there's a parental consent law that you must have parental consent in order to obtain an abortion. And this creates a lot of problems for a lot of minors who might be being raised by a family member that doesn't have legal guardianship, or a family member that could be incarcerated, or even just a family member that's not supported. So they have to take an extra step to figure out how, at their young ages, I'm always amazed, to seek out services for judicial bypass, to have a judge grant them the ability to consent to have an abortion. And so those voices are often also left out of the conversation. And I think we forget that young people have autonomy and have autonomous bodies and need to be able to make decisions around that, including birth control. So I think that people in rural areas and that young people are also some of the people that get left out of this conversation are being affected the most by these laws. And some of these young people aren't even able to vote on the people that are making the laws because they're too young.
I'm wondering if we can get into what's going on throughout the South, because I think this hit a lot of people very hard, where all of a sudden these various state legislatures throughout primarily the South seem to throw out all of these bills that seem to be kind of preempting an overturn of Roe versus Wade. How has that affected kind of the South generally? I know we're based here in Texas, where I don't think something quite that draconian has passed yet, even with all the kind of fights we've had over it. It seems like Texas could very well kind of be next with this. But generally, what sort of is the atmosphere with with kind of people in Texas that you're talking to about what's about to kind of happen with abortion and with Roe v. Wade?
I'm just going to knock on wood. Mentioning it, I think it gives a lot of, I think there's a lot of fear that's kind of being incited in regards to these abortion bans. But to be completely honest, to Amanda's point, yes, abortion is legal. Roe v. Wade made abortion legal. But Roe v. Wade has been chipped away at since the day it was enacted. There are restrictions that have made it very hard or almost impossible for many people to access abortion. And I just think that we're in a time where a lot of people are wondering what's happening in the South. And I want to say that, like, abortion funds and people in the South that do abortion advocacy work have been feeling this pressure for a long time. So we're not that surprised. And also, we're ready to fight. We've been fighting. We've been diligent. We've been ready to fight for this. And I just want to kind of push back a little bit on the fear that is happening, because abortion is still legal in all 50 states currently. There are restrictions, but it is still legal. And I think that we might be pleasantly surprised by what happens when people in the South work together. So much change has happened in our country with United Fronts and people working together to make sure that people are treated justly and fairly. But I think in Texas, one thing that you'll see, maybe if these bans spread closer to our area, is you'll just be hearing more from us. I'm sure people remember HB2 and the filibuster. Imagine that sea of orange and how much it would grow if we had those same kinds of restrictions happening here. So I think that our government is going to have a force to be reckoned with.
And
not just in Texas, but all over the South.
And yeah, HB2, just to remind people, that was the bill around Wendy, or the kind of Wendy Davis filibustered, and that was the one that essentially, if I remember correctly, was trying to force abortion clinics to also become ambulatory surgical centers. Is that correct? Can you maybe? Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. There were a few restrictions. The surgical center was one, having to have abortion providers needing admitting privileges in a hospital, like around 30 miles away from the clinic that they provided services at. There were restrictions around 24-hour waiting periods, which we still have. Amanda, do you remember some of the rest of them?
Mm-hmm. So there was that 24-hour waiting period was actually a previous session, Kamyon, but this bill had the 20-week ban, which was not challenged in court and still stands. This bill also had the medication abortion regulations, the administration of abortion pills having to be administered by the same provider when previously they were able to have nurses provide medication abortion. So that's also a longstanding provision as well.
Yeah, so it almost sounds like in that case, so much of that was simply to provide extra layers of a state bureaucracy for a state that prides itself so much in so-called independence and deregulation and whatnot. They certainly have no problem providing as much absolute bureaucracy, again, which has nothing to do really with the safety of the people getting abortions and everything to do with trying to make them less and less accessible. Yeah, like you were saying, if we were to see a similar sort of a ban in Texas that we've seen in Alabama and across the South, it would absolutely engender the sort of pushback. I think that particular fight, the HB2 we were just talking about, that happened some years back. Really kind of radicalized a lot of people and brought a lot of people into the fold in a way that I think would absolutely happen again. The Capitol at that point was so packed that the strategy that was being used at that point was actually to essentially drown out the sound so that the legislators were getting shouted at so loudly by everyone in the Capitol that they could not, near the end of the day, they could not even get the bill to pass until after midnight, that point at which that that expired. And it actually took some really, really draconian and violent enforcement by DPS, if I remember correctly. That's the Texas Department of Public Safety, essentially coming in and kind of violently clearing people out in order for quote unquote business as usual to continue. So yeah, to me it seems like that would be sort of the setup there. That would be sort of the if such a draconian anti-abortion law were put in place in Texas, that would be kind of the end result of that. So yeah, for those of you who are just tuning in, you are listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. We are joined for the entirety of this episode by Amanda Beatriz Williams, the executive director of the Lilith Fund, and Kamyon Conner, who is the executive director of the Texas Equal Access Fund. Both provide funding and support for abortion throughout much of the state of Texas, with the TEA Fund covering a lot of North Texas and Lilith Fund covering Austin, San Antonio, etc. So yeah, I'm wondering if we can get into a little bit of kind of the history of the fight for reproductive rights. It's not something, and I'll be completely honest, this is not something that I'm nearly as familiar with as I should be. I think the first thing we kind of hear about is Roe versus Wade, and we hear kind of the illegalized abortion. But as we've been talking about, legal abortion doesn't mean that it's accessible abortion. And so much of these laws have been trying to prevent the accessibility. But I'd like to maybe even take kind of a step before that, like sort of how did the organizing come to be that put as much kind of pressure on our court system to feel the need to kind of enshrine abortion as a sort of legal right?
I think that how we got to Roe v. Wade was that people have been having abortions since people have been pregnant. So this notion of criminalizing it and having people seek out abortions in secret really created a system and a dynamic that was harmful for people's physical and mental health. And so I think that is part of the reason why there was such a huge push to make it legal. There have been so few strides made in women's health in general, even thinking about the fight for birth control and how many people died in the trials when they were had the first birth control pills, and that those were communities of color that they tested those pills out on, and that those individuals had a lot of complications. So I think, just the lack of concern and the lack of infrastructure or support around reproductive health in general has made a huge need for abortion in Roe v. Wade due to autonomy, bodily autonomy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll just add, Kamyon, I think that's really, really on point. Specifically, you think of Roe v. Wade and sort of the context of that era and sort of, where the movement was and where we were from more of a social justice lens. It was in the heart of the second wave feminist movement. And Roe v. Wade was won under the premise of this notion of right to privacy, right? So this idea that women had a right to privacy, and I think that really was uplifted, Kamyon, when you mentioned secrecy, because it's sort of always been this like closed door, very secret, very private, very intimate decision making process with, they say like a woman, a doctor and her family or her God. That's the only approach that we've been able to make strides on. I think what we've seen since Roe v. Wade has been this importance of pushing back on these really mainstream ideas of the right to privacy and the right to an abortion under the guise of Roe, because it really has never been enough for us, right? Like we have seen this, I think, in our more recent movement as a community issue, right? As a social justice issue, a public health issue. And that really comes through when we hear all of the wave of storytelling that's been happening in more recent years. But yeah, I think, after Planned Parenthood v. Casey, states were able to get a hold of loopholes and, weasel their way into making more and more restrictions possible. And since that Supreme Court case, we have seen nothing but attempts to roll back on Roe. And, we are gripping at that original notion of right to privacy. It's the woman's decision. We are really gripping a hold of that, but clearly it has not been, that premise has never been enough for us, right? We have lost sight of the realities of people, in particular communities of color, low-income people, and their decision-making process that they make within the context of their families, that they make within the context of their lives as workers or as immigrants or as queer people. But what we were given with Roe v. Wade was a very, sort of narrow idea of a cis white woman who's married. And while valid and important in the stride of our history, it has never really been enough, right, to hold on to. And therefore we've seen this chipping away and these attacks on the state level that are kind of just, leaving us with scraps. And so that is, unfortunately, it's kind of bittersweet, because while we're proud that we have Roe and we honor our ancestors and the folks who led such a great movement for reproductive rights, we also have to balance that and hold space for the reality that it was never enough to start with, and it still isn't enough. And we have to do more, and we have to do right by the people who had a vision for, the right to abortion, but it was not within the context of every person seeking abortion. And that's when, our more recent movement is pushing for a more inclusive conversation and narrative around this much needed care.
I think so much of that is truly important to hear. And I think that understanding that, for instance, it really, as you said, was never enough to begin with. And for those of us who kind of work in political organizing or in these kind of spheres around political organizing, we always see that things are kind of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And I think especially during times of hyper reactionary tendencies, like with the Trump election and the Trump administration, with these sort of kind of full frontal assaults, there's sometimes this this attitude to let oneself become overwhelmed and to say we need to protect the gains it is that we need to protect these kind of half measures, because we've seen half measures in a lot of fields. We've seen that the kind of, and again, I don't mean half measure to be belittling. I just mean like it isn't something that was taken the full way. So for instance, Roe versus Wade established the legality of abortion, but it didn't establish, for instance, the kind of right to a kind of free, easily accessible abortion, et cetera, et cetera. And, of course, you're seeing kind of the conversation change to things about, for instance, cases of rape and incest are usually brought up as kind of the more acceptable abortions or whatnot. And it's like, no, that conversation, that narrowing down of kind of the potentialities really just leads to, I think, the collapse of the entire right. Whereas if you start with that premise that abortion needs to be free and easily accessible and safe for everybody, and not try to put any qualifiers on that, you actually move that needle farther and you get more of what it is you want than if you try and say, oh, well, we need to go into full defense mode. Because I don't think it seems to me like that there's not much of a kind of like that defense mode simply means a kind of gradual withering away, as for instance from my understanding the Democrats did, especially in the 1990s, as they sort of shifted to kind of this language of a safe but rare kind of mentality.
Yeah, I don't love the safe but rare analogy at all. And there are people who support abortion, and Amanda can probably attest to this, that there are people that support abortion, but they want to put qualifiers on it. They want it to be safe and rare, or someone should only have an abortion one time in their life, or, things of that nature. There's a lot of shaming around people seeking abortion care. And that's one of our hugest issues.
That's totally right. It's a cultural phenomenon, right? The way that we perceive abortion, and within this context of our culture that has very specific views on purity and sexuality and the sanctity of marriage, and I mean let's name it. Like, this is like the Christian right. This is white purity. It's white supremacy. I mean these are ingrained in our culture, and they're upheld by our government in so many ways. And that's why it's so important for us to push back with stories of people who are most impacted, who are often, like Kamyon said earlier, left out of this conversation, right? Because these are the realities that we need to instill a new narrative, and to paint a more diverse picture of what's actually happening in our communities. And I think, unfortunately, these are the communities and the stories that our legislature in Texas is very much, well, first of all, they do not represent those communities, right? In terms of their identities, right? They're white, they're men, and they will never know what it's like to have an abortion or to need an abortion, to consider an abortion. And so there's a huge gap in our cultural understanding and alignment in the way that we perceive abortion, especially as an issue of morality. And that's something that has created such a division. And it's something that the right and, the anti-choice lobby and those advocates, that's something that they are just so adamant to uphold, right? This divide based on morality and purity, rooted in, religious hypocrisy and, supremacy. And that's something that we really have to grapple with as a movement. That's something that's very, very, very difficult. I think I've gosh, I don't remember the exact study, but I just read a headline that it said that, there was new data that showed the religious group that has the highest percentage of abortions are Catholics or Christians. Is it Christians or Catholics? I don't even know. Yeah. But it's like can we please, let's talk about this? Let's have that conversation. Yeah. And there's wonderful organizations that we work with, Catholics for Choice and other clergy members with the Texas Freedom Network and other organizations that we partner with all the time. But I see that being like a huge controller of of how the anti-choice, side, not that there's this huge, honestly, there shouldn't be this dichotomy. In reality, people are all over the spectrum of abortion. But, they really wedge that in their divide to keep us apart and to keep us specifically down from their moral high. And that's that's something that I see as a huge, huge problem when we're really starting to dig deep into the cultural awareness of our state and I think our country at large.
Yeah, and I think that is such a terrible position to put people in, to feel like that they're less faithful or less competent in their faith if they choose to have an abortion. There are people that really grapple with this decision based on their faith, even though they know it's what's right for them and their families. And so I think that I am a person of religious faith and I do this work. And there are lots of other people that are people of religious faith and do this work. And a lot of us feel like we are doing God's work. We're really people don't realize how much abortion actually saves people's lives and allows them to have the futures that they've been dreaming of. I think that just needs to be recognized more.
Just to close that loop, I was going to, we have so much data that exists, right? There's the study that we just referenced, but also on our hotlines, we hear stories from our callers every single day who talk to us, who talk to our volunteers, and they share with us that they are Catholic or that this is a challenging decision point in their lives, but it's because of their faith, but it is the best decision for them right now. And that they hope God will forgive them, that this is the best thing that they need to do within the context of their families and their futures and their lives as they are right now. And faith absolutely has an impact on how difficult this decision can be. And I think from all angles, we need to create space for that nuance and also create the space for empathy and for people to really just live in that complexity, because it's never black and white. Faith or not, abortion, the decision to have an abortion, and this is coming from someone I've had an abortion, it's never black and white. And that is something that I think the religious rights, anti-choice lobby and advocates, they do try to make it a dichotomy. It's heaven or hell, and that's a huge problem.
It seems to me that the religious right has succeeded. To the degree that they've succeeded at anything, they're a hot mess. But this kind of religious far right has kind of succeeded in trying to wedge this as kind of a religious issue and then as kind of a cultural and morality issue as well. When I think absolutely this is not something that is really, to me, religious in nature. So for me, I was trying to understand. It's not enough for me to just understand that oppression is happening, and it's not enough to just sort of buy whatever the narrative might be for why that oppression happens without really questioning how is it that a certain type of kind of denial of rights to people comes into being. And to me, I look at religion and I look at the kind of culture of the South, and it's not really a religious or cultural thing, because on the one hand, religion itself constitutes so many kind of diverse, varying viewpoints, and this idea that Christianity is fundamentally kind of politically conservative and reactionary in this way does not constitute the vast majority of what Christianity has been throughout history, much less any of the other religions. When you have such things as a liberation theology, for instance, in Latin America, when you have so many kind of progressive Christian preachers throughout the world, when you have kind of different branches of Christianity, and when so much of this is so much more diversified than the religious right would like you to believe. And then kind of the other part of that equation to me is that so much of this by kind of both sides gets pinned as sort of a Southern issue. That is to say, it's it becomes a very easy scapegoat to kind of blame, especially for a kind of Northern progressive or liberal types, to kind of blame the severe anti-choice legislation on the quote unquote trailer trash, or the poor kind of like poor dumb religious Southerners, when in reality, if you look at the population of any of these states, especially given that so many of these southern states are very have very large black populations, it's not that the states are dumb. It's not that the people are dumb. It's that the legislatures in these states are just so much more draconian and so much more oppressive than the constituencies they represent, I feel like. So, instead of sort of blaming the southern populations, especially the poor southern populations, for these for the problems, I feel like you need to really blame these legislatures for and the systems of government for creating such a just tight draconian control over their own populations, and not really representing, I think, the vast broad viewpoints of the people they represent. At least that's kind of my take on that.
Yeah, I mean, Brian, I think you're totally right. One thing that became really clear to me, because we literally just closed up another legislative session yesterday, right? Like yesterday was Sine Dio's last day of the legislative session that meets every 2 years. And it's a very short time frame, and that's something when you really start to think about the structure of the legislative session and the processes, and the different rules and regulations and the different steps and the different, quote, opportunities for public engagement, and the hearings that they hold and the testimony that they allow, you begin to really take note of how inaccessible the process is, how inaccessible the legislative process is as a whole, and not even mentioning gerrymandering and, voter suppression. That's in my mind, that's like a whole other thing. But then you look at the actual legislative process, I can't tell you. So first of all, there were over 30 anti-choice bills filed this session, and in the state of Texas. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of people don't even realize that. So yes, we don't have an Alabama ban in Texas, but they tried, right? There was actually close to it. There was actually a 6-week ban that was proposed among 29, 30 plus other anti-choice bills that were terrifying, just absolutely horrible anti-choice bills that would, result in almost an all-out ban. And so we have to remember that. Go on, Kamyon.
I was going to say there was that one bill that was proposed that would make it illegal to provide an abortion or obtain one punishable by the death penalty in the state of Texas. Yeah. So they're trying.
They are trying. It's not, we got to give it to them. It's not for lack of trying. I think we barely made it out with just I think 2 or 3 that we were really watching that were bad bills. But then we also had a lot of good bills that didn't make it. And so
like Rosie's Law.
Like Rosie's Law, which we should talk about. But the whole process itself, you realize how little accessibility there really is for everyday people to come and meet with their legislators or to testify on a bill. And it's all happening in Austin. So there's just a number of barriers to even have your voice heard during the process, but much less, during the electoral process, which is a whole other thing.
I was going to say this was my first time being involved at this capacity with the Texas legislature this year, doing my work with T-Fund, and I learned so much about how hard they make it because we're not based in Austin. We're based in the DFW area. So there would be times when a hearing is scheduled and you want to go testify, and then they never get to it on the agenda. Meanwhile, people who don't live in Austin take the whole day off to come there to show their support, and then the hearing gets pushed to some other day. there's just like a lot of, you can't make testimony unless you're in the building. You can't file written testimony unless you're on the property. Like, there are just so many restrictions that make it so hard for people to engage in their civic and government opportunities like we should be able to.
Oh, absolutely. The level of state bureaucracy, if you want to actually participate in a democratic system, is kind of horrific. Just to give sort of one example, I was following the HB, again, this is Texas House Bill 3557 regarding basically protests of oil pipelines, even though they didn't put it that way. It was a quote-unquote critical infrastructure bill, where essentially they made it a felony to protest the building of oil pipelines, even if it was on your own land. So like, these oil companies have been using eminent domain to essentially seize other people's land, use the state of Texas to come in and just seize other people's land to build these oil pipelines. And if it's your land, or if it's your neighbor's land and you don't want it and they don't want it and nobody in the community wants it, now it is a felony for you to protest that oil pipeline, because basically they looked at what happened at Standing Rock and they wanted to say not here. And so even though I'm thinking of all the people I know, and I know people from kind of wide swaths of the political spectrum, of the ideological spectrum, and by and large, most people I know would not want this sort of thing, but there was no real process of engagement. The actual vote on this took place. I don't think it was supposed to take place until 11:10 p.m. A couple nights back, but instead, it was voted on earlier, and you had to go through like this elaborate kind of sign up process and whatnot. At every kind of level, they make it as hard as possible for their constituency. Generally, like the Texas legislature makes it so hard for their constituency to hold them accountable for anything at all, when Texas is such a large state. I couldn't imagine, say, if I were someone who had a stake in something going on in my community in, say, like West Texas, where I didn't want them to build an oil pipeline or something, or if for much of kind of rural Texas who doesn't have access to any sort of abortion site within hundreds of miles, I forget the statistics, and you want to go and make that sort of change, Austin is hundreds of miles away, and it just, that level of engagement just is not really possible with the system that's set up that way. There's no kind of way to either hold people accountable, and there's often no way for them like to even kind of hear what it is you have to say. I know, for instance, somebody tried to question their own legislator, and they, the person literally ran away from them, and then they tried to post the video online, and the person blocked them on Twitter. The legislator blocked them on Twitter. So it's just, it's the complete lack of accountability of people in Texas, of legislatures in Texas in particular. If you're just tuning in, you are listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. We are talking with Amanda Beatriz Williams, as well as Kamyon Conner, of various kind of funds for abortion and all sorts of reproductive services, about kind of the state of abortion in Texas. Let's actually pivot to that, because this is this is not the first time we've kind of fought this battle with the Texas legislature. I'm forgetting the exact year, but I want to say it was either 2013 or 2014, going back to kind of that moment at the Capitol with the Wendy Davis filibuster, and where essentially the Capitol had reached kind of critical mass, where they were at one point unable to actually pass a bill. What generally nonetheless, the bill, I believe, was rammed through. So what generally is the state of like abortion access in Texas? Like, where, if someone were to need to get an abortion, where generally could they go, and where are sort of the most, the areas kind of most affected by this kind of gradual chipping away?
Amanda might have something different to say about this, but I think that the closing of like over half the clinics in Texas by HB2 has been the biggest barrier for people accessing abortion outside of financial resources and lack of coverage for abortion with any type of insurance, private or public. I think those are the hugest barriers to people accessing abortion in Texas right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would agree. And the legislature has been pushing funding cuts for healthcare providers, actually dating even before HB2. We saw a bunch of funding cuts in 2011. They dismantled the, women's health program, and honestly, our state has never recovered. And then coupled with HB2, Kamyon's right. Like, we saw, close to half of the clinics at that point, just in those last, that few year time period, we saw our state had over 40 clinics to, something like 20. And we're still kind of trying to build those up, right? And, and it's hard. Like, the damage is already done. Like, it's near impossible to reopen a clinic once it has been forced to close. I mean, staffing alone, but also just the expenses. Like, it really hits providers hard, but specifically the independent and the smaller providers. And that's something I think that gets lost in this conversation, especially when the legislature often targets Planned Parenthood, right? They're typically the ones that have the target, but unfortunately, it's the smaller independent providers that are some among the first to close their doors. And what we see now is something around 2022 clinics in Texas, and only a few of those have actually been reopened. Some are new, but they're all in major cities. So Kamyon mentioned before, rural communities. We also can't forget about undocumented immigrants who have to, travel to get their abortion care. There's only one abortion clinic south of San Antonio, and that's in McAllen. It's an independent provider called Whole Woman's Health. And, if they're undocumented, they do have to pass a border checkpoint to get north to the nearest abortion clinic in San Antonio. And of course, there's a 20-week ban in place. And then there's also an ambulatory surgical center requirement that dates back several sessions that requires all abortions after 16 weeks to be done in an ambulatory surgical center. So again, that indie provider, Whole Woman's Health in McAllen, if someone is over that mark and, further along in their pregnancy, they have to travel for an abortion. And again, if they're undocumented, they have no options. And so travel alone, just because of the sheer timing of your pursuit of getting it, just the timing that you're wanting to terminate your pregnancy, that could be a huge deterrent. You might have to travel out of state. We actually hear from many, many clients on our hotline who are over 20 weeks and, still trying to gather the money, and the price increases every single week after 12 weeks. So sometimes they get priced out, and then they're past the 20-week limit, and now they have to pay for a plane ticket to one of our neighboring states that go farther. And so this is a huge barrier, and it just kind of, it's all compounded with all of the logistical needs. We also can't forget that right now we're also seeing a fight for, paid sick days, which, we can kind of take a deep breath on that. But,
adding that into the conversation, super important, because as you heard from both of us, maybe you didn't hear from me, but 70% of our callers are people that are already parenting. So imagine that you have to take time off work and not get paid because you don't get paid sick leave. You also have to find childcare for your children or find a way to get transportation for them to come with you to another state if they're over 20 weeks. Not to mention that you also then have to find and pay for lodging in another state before you can come back. There's surmounting barriers.
Yeah, and you might have to forego wages. And I've heard, callers on our hotline who will wait to schedule their appointment for a time when they have 2 consecutive days off. Like when their employer is just giving them maybe they have they're scheduled, they're like a server, and on the schedule they notice they have 2 days off. And that's the time that they want to pick for their abortion because they can't risk asking for time off. They don't have any vacation days or benefits, and they definitely don't have paid sick time. So this is something that comes up, and it very much intersects with all of these different issues related to just being a human, just living your life. And this is one of the most, targeted, singled out medical procedures on the books simply because the anti-choice legislators are hell-bent on making it impossible.
Yeah, it's kind of the most illegal legal thing it feels like there is. Yeah. Even though again, technically legal, but when there's no access to it, if something's legal but there's no access, it really the legality of that only really matters so much. And I think kind of hearing those stories has been kind of absolutely key. And I'm glad you kind of connected that issue of, for instance, the paid sick time, paid sick leave fight we've been having, and just generally the kind of employment barriers, because then that then also becomes a tax, I think, on the poor, again, primarily women, also trans men, non-binary people, who need access to these, who need access to these things, but don't have the kind of luxury, the either free time or money to be able to travel the massive distances. It's also just kind of mind blowing to me that for a state as large as Texas, there are only some 20 some abortion clinics. When I don't think people outside of Texas necessarily understand unless they've driven through it, they don't understand how large Texas is. And imagine north and south, east and west, there only being 20. And only one south of San Antonio is absurd to me.
Yeah. A lot. Not to mention our lack of infrastructure for public transportation in this state, so it doesn't make it easy for anybody to get anywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that's also, again, like all these things I would say are so kind of intricately connected. So, and that's one of the things I would say is, like, if you consider yourself for this or that right, but you're not thinking of how do we publicly fund this or that. So, for instance, if you consider yourself someone who wants to, someone who is pro-choice, who thinks women should have access to abortion, or thinks that abortion should be legal, but isn't also willing to put in the kind of funding for, like, the public infrastructure, put in the funding for paid sick leave and all that, so that women can actually have the time off to do these things, to get, and if you're not for kind of funding, again, like the construction and I would say, like, the free access to abortion, because abortion needs to be, in order to truly be accessible for everybody, for it to truly be a right, it needs to be free and it needs to be easily accessible. It can't just be a right on paper.
Absolutely. It needs to be, we need to declare that abortion is healthcare, right? Like, and even then, it's not far enough, because people are still having trouble accessing all forms of healthcare.
Yeah.
Some of the highest uninsured rates. But I think, step one is we need to make sure we're having the conversation of abortion within the scope and context of healthcare, and everyone deserves healthcare. It's a human right. You're absolutely right, Brian. It should be free. It should be accessible. And people shouldn't have to be shamed for visiting their healthcare provider.
Something that I know that we touched on lightly, but the two funds, in conjunction with the Lilith Fund and Friend Care Fund, which is another abortion fund located in the Valley in Texas, in McAllen, we had a bill filed with the Texas legislature this year called Rosie's Law, and it would have expanded Medicaid coverage to include abortion, so that those that are eligible for Medicaid would be able to access abortion. The Hyde Amendment makes it illegal or not accessible for public insurance to cover abortion, but states are able to decide. So there are some states where their public insurance does cover abortion, but Texas is not one of those. And so we did try to expand access in that way in our state, but of course our lawmakers did not want to have it. And so we could really use support in those avenues as well, supporting pro-choice and pro-abortion candidates and pro-choice and pro-abortion laws.
I'm wondering in our last few minutes, if there's anything else you'd kind of like to either add to the conversation that you feel like people just generally need to understand about kind of abortion and abortion access in Texas, any kind of misconceptions or other just kind of info you'd like to clear up and provide for people. And then where can people kind of find more information about just generally the entire issue, but also kind of about your organizations.
Yeah, so I guess I would like to add something that we've already mentioned is that not just in Texas, but everywhere, abortion needs to be considered a part of reproductive health care. And reproductive health care needs to be funded and accessible to everyone, including comprehensive sex education for all gender identities and sexual orientation. And I would like to add that you can keep up with our work. We need volunteers and we need supporters in our community. So you can find us on Facebook, social media, Instagram. We are at TAFUND at T-Fund. You can find us on social media there and our website, tfund.org.
Yeah, and I guess just to echo Kamyon, one of the most powerful tools that we can use to fight the stigma around abortion, to change the culture of abortion, to fight back against the anti-choice attacks that are happening at the state and local levels is to share our stories. Chances are that someone who's had an abortion. 1 in 4 pregnant, capable people have had an abortion. So just think about that statistic, and you'll understand that it is likely that someone who's had an abortion. I am someone who's had an abortion, so now you have now heard the voice of someone who has had an abortion. If you did not know that, and we are people, and I think that is something that the right and anti-choice advocates really try to, they try to dehumanize people who have abortions, and that's simply not right. And we have to just remember that, it is a human right. And if you have a story in connection to abortion, we should be talking about it more. As Renee Bracey Sherman, who is a storytelling activist in our movement, she kind of coined the term, everyone loves someone who has had an abortion. And to me, that's something that, we really should live by that and enact laws by that fact. And so that's something that's really, really important in our work. And so you can, similar to T-Fund, you can find us online. We're on social media at Lilith Fund. That's LILITH Fund, FUND, lilithfund.org. And of course, as always, please, don't forget to donate to your local abortion funds, because that's something that's really, really important, but especially in times like these.
Yeah.
Please fund abortion and build power.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both so much. So I just want to briefly wrap up and say we've been talking with Kamyon Conner, the executive director of the Texas Equal Access Fund, as well as Beatriz Williams, the executive director of the Lilith Fund. Both provide funds for abortion and all sorts of other services. Thank you both very much for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having us.
That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP Austin and is also available as a podcast on Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. We are out of here.